What's going on, guys? Andrew of Newbark Gaming back here, and today we're going to be talking some about Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains episode 92. Now, I want to start off this review by talking about what was probably my favorite part of the episode, and that's watching Bowman's character development continue to grow and go further, essentially. Now, one thing we have to remind before kind of analyzing how it occurs within this episode is the fact that Bowman was created by Lightning to essentially be the next step in quote-unquote evolution for these Ignises, and the way that was sort of portrayed, at least to me, was the fact that Bowman was more or less supposed to take the best qualities of these Ignises and the best qualities of humans and kind of mash them together into one sort of ultimate being, so to speak. And why do I say that? Well, yes, Bowman's an Ignis, and yes, Lightning often talks down about humans, but at the same time, Lightning frequently had set up Bowman to be able to learn from Playmker, and Bowman even says himself within this episode that he was essentially based off Playmker, who we have to remember is a human, and at least when it comes to dueling, Playmaker's sort of like the ideal human in a lot of people's eyes, so he would be the best model for someone like Bowman to learn from. So essentially, Bowman we've gotten to watch evolve, grow, and develop with every interaction he's had with humans, and we've seen his emotional spectrum, his perspective on dueling, and everything else continuously shift within the show. Overall, I think it's actually been one of the best character development arcs we've had in Yu-Gi-Oh! Period, regardless of whether we're talking about antagonists, best friends, main characters, etc. And that's why I think in this episode, it's really awesome to see that actually start to come to a head to some extent. And how does this begin to occur, you may ask? Well, essentially Lightning plans out this episode to put Kusanagi and Playmker both in a no-win scenario. The idea is that basically he pins Kusanagi against Playmker, so that way, regardless of who wins, Lightning comes out ahead. Because if Kusanagi wins, well then Playmaker's down, his consciousness data is erased as a result of the rules within Mirror Lake Vrains, and who is essentially his best opponent is now taken out of the game. It's like playing chess and then your opponent loses their queen, right? So with that being the case, Lightning would then be at a major advantage. Now, if Playmaker is to win, he's going to be left so emotionally scarred that Lightning believes he's not going to be able to press forward, and there's a pretty valid argument to be made there, especially considering Kusanagi is Playmaker's longest running friend. So this is a really good strategy on Lightning's part. Now, what's interesting to me about this, though, is Bowman's very, very quiet when Lightning's bringing up this plan. Lightning's talking about the series of advantages it provides to them, and Bowman stays relatively stoic, keeps his sentences short and simple, sort of just replies to it, and he actually goes on to essentially warn Playmker that, hey, your biggest challenge is about to be in front of you. We're going to be sending something your way that I don't think you're necessarily prepared for. Now, does he outright tell Playmker what's coming? No, so I don't think he's necessarily broken from his bond with Lightning, being on the same side of Lightning yet. But the fact that he even warned Playmker about this strikes me as this sort of moral development that we've seen grow within Bowman. I mean, bear in mind, just last episode, he was merciful enough to allow Aoi and Akira to interact one last time before Aoi's consciousness data was erased. Why? Because he saw the kind of emotional turmoil it caused within him to not have that opportunity with Haru, so he wanted to spare Aoi and Akira from needing to deal with that themselves. Once more, emotional development, moral development. So he goes and reaches out to Playmker because part of him, it seems to me at least, doesn't necessarily feel what Lightning is doing is right here. He's essentially taking advantage of the fact that emotions are there for humans. And this is the point at which Bowman essentially tells Playmker, Lightning says emotions are a weakness to you humans, and if we exploit that, then we will be able to easily defeat you. Now, the key part of this sentence is the fact that he says Lightning says that emotions are humans' weakness. This implies to me, when put in tandem with all the actions we've seen Bowman take here recently, that Bowman is really beginning to develop some sort of appreciation for emotions. That even if sometimes they do cause a lot of inner turmoil and conflict, they also bring out a lot of strength, a lot of power, and a side of life with a certain sense of beauty that he may not be willing to give up quite yet. After all, why else would he be reaching out to Playmker right now? It doesn't benefit his side in any way whatsoever to let Playmker know it's coming, because honestly, it would probably be even stronger for Lightning and Bowman if Playmker went into this duel with Kusanagi blind, and while he is to some extent, he was at least aware that a challenge was awaiting him, and Bowman didn't have to do anything at all. Clearly, some part of him feels guilty. And another aspect within this episode that really builds on this idea of moral development for Bowman is the fact that it was just at the end of last episode, going into the beginning of this episode, that he had finished absorbing Aqua and let Aoi essentially go. And the kind of key point here is the fact that Aqua, out of all the Ignises that we've been exposed to and all the personalities we've seen have them interact with each other, was essentially the moral high ground, the moral compass for all of the Ignises. She was the one who was able to emotionally connect with all of them the most, and the other Ignis that currently resides within Bowman, the other one whose data he was able to absorb being Earth, well, the key point there is that Earth was essentially in love with Aqua, and when we're talking about all these emotional things, love, we have to remember, at its core is one of, if not the most powerful emotion that can be felt. So now he's got the data of these two Ignises that were very close to each other, in addition to the fact that one of those Ignises was essentially the strongest morally, the strongest emotional connector, the most empathetic of all of them existing within them. That would also imply that this data is flowing through Bowman as much as anything that Lightning programmed into him, and seems to, at least to some extent, directly contradict what Lightning programmed into him, and that could be helping to allow for this evolution of Bowman emotionally, and allow for him to continue to learn to understand the ideas of compassion and empathy, what is right, what is wrong, how to feel, how to react to certain situations. And on the whole, I just have to say, I think that's a really good way for this to be developed and to be written out if this is the direction that they're going with Bowman. If their idea is to build on him coming to essentially appreciate the human aspect of things and being able to see their side of view and potentially even end up turning against Lightning at some point down the line, similar to what we saw Aporia do against Zone in 5Ds. Now, obviously, this is no guarantee at this point in the show, but I think it's a really well-written arc if that is the direction they're going, or even if they're going to just continue to flesh out Bowman's character development. I think there's some nice subtlety in there with the fact that Aqua was absorbed and she was such an emotional compass for everybody, and now that data would be flowing through him. I think there's some well-written, more obvious points in the way that he's emotionally behaving. I just think it's a very well-written arc in terms of his development. Once more, guys, I'm really appreciating this part of the show, so be sure to let me know your thoughts, comments, and such on how Bowman's developed so far. I know most of the time in my reviews, especially early on with this character, I was very lukewarm towards receiving him, but in these past 5 to 10 episodes, he's really come around for me. So let's go ahead and start delving into what happened in the rest of the episode. And much like most episodes within Yu-Gi-Oh!, this one centers around a duel, that in this case being between Kusanagi and Playmaker. So let's go ahead and break down how both of these duelists are mentally going into this duel. Starting off with Kusanagi, there's a couple of key actions that occur around him before the duel even starts in this episode. The first of which being what brings him to dueling Yusaku in the first place. After all, they are friends, right? Well, he hears Jin's voice through this monitor and then essentially enters Link Vrains in order to investigate what's going on. This leads to his first direct interactions with Lightning, at which rate Lightning immediately proceeds to leverage the fact that he has Jin's consciousness data literally under his floorboards to force Kusanagi to duel Playmaker under a couple of conditions. The first of which being, if he doesn't at least genuinely attempt to defeat Playmaker, Lightning's going to destroy Jin's consciousness data, therefore Jin can never be restored to the brother Kusanagi once knew. In addition to that, a draw does not count as a genuine attempt. That will still lead to Jin's consciousness data being destroyed. And thirdly, the only way Lightning's even guaranteeing that he will protect Jin's consciousness data or leave it as is for now is if Kusanagi wins the duel. Now this of course backs Kusanagi into a corner. That being said, there was another key action that Kusanagi took before entering this duel, and that was we saw him toying with some sort of a file on his computer. Now, later in the episode, we find the Knights of Hanoi receive a file from Kusanagi in regards to being able to hack into Mirror Link Vrains. We can assume these are most likely the same file. After all, the Knights of Hanoi comment that, oh, Kusanagi must have seen this coming. And the subject they seem to be talking about in the context of this episode primarily is the duel between Yusaku and Kusanagi. So most likely what this that he saw coming was the fact that eventually Lightning was going to leverage the fact that he had control of Jin on Kusanagi to force Kusanagi to do something against Playmaker or somebody else in such a way that he was basically pinned into a corner, which is what ends up happening here. So the question sort of becomes what is Kusanagi's intention going into this duel? And there can obviously be made a couple different cases for this. The first of which being, yes, he is genuinely trying to defeat Playmaker. He sees working with Lightning as the only way to guarantee his brother's safety. And I believe some extent of that is true either way, because even if where I'm going with the second theory is true, he's kind of relying on a lot of ifs and maybes, and it's very obvious within the context of this duel that at the very least, Kusanagi has prioritized his brother's safety from the very beginning of the show, and it is always and always will be his #1 priority. So even though he has a very close bond with Playmaker, even in the episode preview shown at the end of this for episode 93 that's coming up, he's begging Yusaku to understand the fact that he must protect Jin. So that's his #1 priority. Once more, I believe the fact that he needs to protect Jin, the fact that he believes working with Lightning is the only guaranteed way to do that, is to at least some extent true. So he's at least partially fully in on this. Now the other option is he's mainly trying to stall, because this program he sent to the Knights of Hanoi is incomplete. Now, that being said, the Knights of Hanoi quickly comment, hey, if we all work together, we can pretty quickly complete this program. So that leads us to kind of speculate, what exactly does this program do? Now, it could do any number of things. We don't know how much power they may be able to leverage over Mirror Link Vrains. Currently, as things stand, Bowman has managed to create earthquakes within regular Link Vrains from Mirror Link Vrains. They've managed to make it so that Mirror Link Vrains has its own special dueling conditions in which the loser's data is basically wiped out entirely, and so we can more or less assume that Bowman and Lightning can play by whatever rules they want within this world, and being unable to access it from the outside world, Yusaku's team's basically helpless there and forced to play into Lightning's game. That being said, if this hacking program works, we have to wonder to what extent will it work? How much are they able to rewrite the rules within Mirror Link Vrains? Is it possible that they could maybe make it so that regardless of who loses, nothing happens? Or maybe they could make it so that if Playmker wins, Kusanagi's data isn't deleted, or vice versa. And the bigger question at that point is, could they do this under Lightning's nose to such an extent that Kusanagi could beat Playmker? Maybe they could forge it so it looks like Playmaker's getting deleted, but in reality he really isn't, and then they rescue him. Or something crazy along those lines, basically manage to neutralize the situation so that nothing bad is happening, and Kusanagi's putting forth and playing into that side of himself that feels he needs to work with Lightning to protect his brother as much as possible to put on a show for Lightning, to make it so that Lightning won't harm his brother while this program is being completed. That I find to be at least a little more likely, even if Kusanagi's actions don't line up with it so far. I feel it would be a little inconsistent with his character to just outright be willing to go against Playmker and watch his data get deleted based on everything we've seen from Kusanagi so far. Additionally, on top of that, we also have to recount the fact that in the brief flashbacks where we saw a brief glimpse of Kusanagi dueling in the past, one of his big comments to Playmker, and one of the big reasons that he says he started working with Playmker in the first place, was he was not good enough at dueling to carry out what were his intentions on his own. So if his analysis of his own dueling skills is in fact correct, he may actually be able to duel in what is essentially an all-out manner without bringing any harm to Playmker whatsoever. For all intents and purposes, from what we've seen on screen in Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains so far, Playmker is either the best or the second best duelist in all of this world. The only person he's sort of kind of lost to is Bowman, because Bowman says he allowed Playmker to win the duel so he could see more of Playmaker's plays to learn from. So once more, Playmaker's a crazy good duelist versus Kusanagi's portrayed as sort of being mediocre, so he may be able to accurately portray an all-out duel with the knowledge in the back of his head that Playmaker can defend himself against this anyway. I don't need to worry about harming my friend, even if I go all out. So let's go ahead and flip to the Playmaker side of this duel, and this is where I am actually a lot more intrigued, because so far I think this has been the big thing Playmaker's been missing from his character development, and that is some sort of major emotional struggle. Now obviously Yusaku as a character has suffered a lot throughout his life. That's not the issue here. He's a character who has had a lot of struggles. I mean, he went through the Lost incident, which essentially scarred him for the remainder of his life. He was dealing with the fact that he felt he needed to find some sort of vengeance against the Knights of Hanoi. He was dealing with the fact that he was trying to help his friend rescue his brother, and now he's dealing with the fact that there's some sort of weight on his shoulders to essentially protect humanity from someone like Lightning. But where I think he's really missing is some sort of divide in his motives. Most of our Yu-Gi-Oh! Protagonists in the past have faced some sort of tough choices, some sort of difficulties. For example, Yuma, with the fact that he watched several of his friends turn out to be Baryons who he then had to fight in some way, shape, or form. Or for the example of Yusei, he had to deal with the fact that he was feeling a lot of guilt for the fact that his father was one of the biggest contributors in the Moment project that ended up blowing up and destroying a good chunk of Neo Domino City, thus leaving his two best friends, Crow and Jack, in the orphanage that they were in alongside with him, in addition to the fact that he had that entire duel with Kiryu, which was a big struggle on his guilt, his emotional sense, his sense of strength, his sense of will, and his sense of purpose to begin with. Yusaku hasn't necessarily had a struggle like that up to this point. Versus here, now he's finally in a position where he has to make some sort of an emotional choice, where neither option is very clearly the better one, so to speak. On the one hand, if he wins, then he may manage to protect humanity. After all, he's probably the best duelist to face Bowman at this point and has the best shot of winning, thus stopping Bowman and Lightning's plan to do as they wish with humanity, which most likely isn't good. On the other hand, if he loses, his data will be deleted. After all, they're dueling within Mirror Link Vrains, at which point, then who's going to protect humanity? Yes, he saved his friend, but there's everybody else left, and will Kusanagi even survive in the long run? And once more, we have to also bear in mind, going into this, Playmaker's completely oblivious to the fact that Kusanagi sent this file over to the Knights of Hanoi to potentially be worked on that may be able to fix things for them. He doesn't know any of that, and even if that is Kusanagi's plan, it's pretty heavily implied that if Kusanagi makes one false step, Lightning's going to snap his brother's consciousness data like a pencil, like a piece of wood, and it's going to just disappear, right? So Kusanagi can't necessarily communicate any back of his mind ways out of this to Yusaku. So Yusaku, as far as he's concerned, is in this sort of no-win scenario. And we also have to keep in mind that Yusaku's not fully aware of the conditions under which Kusanagi is dueling either. He can make some pretty clear assumptions, but he doesn't know the exact conditions of things, and so he has to play on a very ambiguous plate. On top of that, he's also thrown into an environment that resembles essentially the outside of Kusanagi's hot dog stand. Granted, this is within Mirror Link Vrains, not the real world, but this is where several serious events have happened between Yusaku and Kusanagi, which I'm sure adds to the emotional struggle because it reminds him of how they met, how they became friends, how they started this journey against the Knights of Hanoi, how they started this journey against fighting the evil Ignises like Lightning. All of that was sparked around this area, around the hot dog stand, and that's where they're dueling right now, or at least a simulated equivalent of it. So with that being said, Yusaku's in absolute turmoil. That's why he keeps refusing to duel Kusanagi outright, because he's afraid of harming his friend. It's very reminiscent of the duel between Yugi and Joey in the Battle City arc of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters. Yugi was in a no-win scenario. If he lost, then the puzzle could potentially go to Merrick, or he could potentially drown, depending on how the duel ended up playing out, and Merrick would likely end up with the puzzle anyway. If he wins, Joey could potentially drown, and Joey's his best friend. So either way, it doesn't end up being a winning scenario. What does Yugi do? Well, he uses the Red Eyes Black Dragon card to basically try and shake Joey away from Merrick's control. This situation isn't exactly the same given how Kusanagi's not really brain controlled at this point, at least to the best of our knowledge, but Yusaku uses a card with similar value for their relationship, being Decode Talker. This marked the start of their journey that's been on film for those of us viewers, in that Decode Talker was the first card Yusaku recovered from the Data Storm. Kusanagi then managed to manifest it from their trailer where they do the hot dog stand, and this card, once more, it was kind of a starting point for their journey. It had a lot of value to these two and their friendship, and so Yusaku summons it as quickly as he can, even if it wasn't necessarily the best strategic decision, in order to try and rattle Kusanagi awake. Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be going too well for him, thus proceeding to put him through this emotional struggle. But once more, I think this is key development for his character. I love how the writers are doing this for him, even if it's in reality a very crappy situation to be in. So this sort of brings us full circle on the episode, in that we have to ask ourselves, is Lightning's plan working at this point? And I think it genuinely is. You have Soulburner and Revolver, who are essentially imprisoned and helpless to help in any way in a dueling style, and are helpless and just watching their allies fall by the wayside. We had Aoi go down, we had Blood Shepherd go down. Now we're either likely going to see Kusanagi or Playmaker fall, or some other bad result from this duel, and that's going to be emotionally demoralizing those two. Even if Revolver is not necessarily the type to reveal it, I'm sure we'll be seeing a reaction out of Soulburner. Flame's already beginning to point out the kind of no-win scenario that they're in. We have Akira panicking at the beginning of this episode after watching his sister fall, and trying to pin all of Soul Technology's resources to trying to recover his sister, thus causing him to lose his train of thought on protecting the people still stuck within Link Vrains as is, who are also helpless and basically imprisoned in a similar manner to the way that Soulburner and Revolver are, only they won't get a chance to fight the way those ones will. So they're kind of helpless, they're sort of scrambling. Emma's tailing from the fact that she lost her brother, and she's trying to keep Akira focused to be able to bail out the people in Link Vrains, so they're spiraling as well. The Knights of Hanoi, who are in the backseat trying to work on hacking, need to now focus on completing Kusanagi's program over whatever they were doing before in order to try and help Kusanagi and Playmaker's situation, and essentially everybody's kind of left divided and helpless to one another, which means Lightning's puppeteering plan to demoralize everybody, make them realize how helpless they really are, seems to be working so far. It's causing some panic, it's causing some disarray, it's causing people's communications to break down a little bit, it's causing distractions, it's forcing Kusanagi and Playmaker into no-win scenarios, at which rate we have to consider that Lightning's a very, very smart antagonist, probably one of the smartest we've seen in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! The way that he's playing with characters' emotions. Which brings us back just for a second to Kusanagi's program from before. Kusanagi seemed to show some level of awareness that Lightning could puppeteer the fact that Jin was essentially in his possession against Kusanagi, and likely would have acknowledged the fact that Lightning was doing a lot of puppeteering to try and put Playmaker's team in a no-win scenario. At which rate this program once more exists. So we have to consider, what does this program do? Is it possible that Kusanagi's willing to participate in this duel, willing to go full force in order to do a sort of self-sacrificing deed so that this program can be completed while Lightning's distracted, while Bowman is likely also distracted, thus removing the two key players from Lightning's team, so that this program can be completed without their witnessing, and so the Knights can then get into Mirror Link Vrains and perhaps shut all of this down? Is this maybe a sacrifice play? The other thing that seems to sort of indicate this is the fact that we have a new intro coming to Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains pretty soon, within the next month and a half or so, at which point this season arc likely needs to be wrapping up pretty soon here. So something like that while it does seem a little oddball and out of left field, I don't think is necessarily entirely impossible. I think this program is going to be a key plot point moving forward. So with all that being said, guys, that's going to overall wrap up my thoughts on this episode. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. If not, constructive criticism is always welcome, and I'll catch you guys next time with some more Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains.